The earth had gone quiet. Not the quiet of an empty house or the stillness of a deep forest before dawn, but something deeper, something absolute. There was no whisper of the wind through abandoned streets, no distant murmur of the oceans, no hum of insects hidden in the grass. Silence had swallowed the world whole. It hadn't happened all at once. In the beginning, people dismissed it as a trick of the mind, those brief moments when the world seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. Then came the reports, cities where everything had gone eerily silent overnight, forests where not even the rustling of leaves could be heard. Scientists tried to explain it, governments tried to control the fear, but by then, it was too late. The silence spread like an infection. People screamed, but their voices never reached the air. They banged on walls, shattered windows, but the sound never came. And then, just like that, they vanished. No bodies, no traces, just the remnants of a civilization left behind as though humanity had never been there at all. Cities still stood, untouched. Machines still hummed in factories, though they produced nothing. Cars sat abandoned on highways, their doors open, their drivers missing. Homes were still filled with half-eaten meals, with clothes laid out on beds, with televisions playing silent images to empty rooms. There was no decay, no ruin, only absence. Except for them, the ones who had caused it. They had never belonged to humanity, not really. They had moved through the world unnoticed, living in the spaces between lives, in the background of crowded rooms, at the edges of photographs where no one remembered seeing them. They had been here longer than human memory could stretch, waiting, blending in, watching. They weren't sure when the hunger had started. It had been so slow at first, just an experiment, a gentle touch against the edges of the world's sound. They had reached into the fabric of existence and pulled just a little, just enough to steal a moment of quiet. It had felt good, and so they had done it again. They never intended for it to go this far, but the silence was intoxicating and they had wanted more. They took it in pieces, first a whisper, then a voice, then the cacophony of cities. No one had noticed the gradual loss of sound, not at first. But the silence grew, stretched, became something real, something alive. And then, without warning, it took everything. Now they were the only ones left. At first they believed they had won. They had stolen the voices of the world, consumed them, and remained standing in the stillness of their own making. They wandered the empty earth like gods, stepping through abandoned streets, past silent rivers, beneath mute skies. There was no more chaos, no more meaningless noise. But then the disappearances began. It was subtle at first. One of them would turn a corner, step into an alley, walk into a house, and never come out. The others would wait, confused, search, find nothing. They were the last ones left in a world they had silenced, and now something was hunting them. The rules of the old world had broken with the loss of sound. There was no warning, no distant footsteps to signal an approach, no whispers in the dark to give away a presence. It came without noise, without movement, without logic. One moment they were together, the next one of them was simply gone. They tried to run. It was instinct, an old habit from the time when the world was filled with humans who might notice them, who might grow suspicious. Running had always kept them safe. But now there was nothing to run from. Only the silence. And yet they ran anyway. Across highways littered with motionless cars, through forests where the wind no longer spoke to the trees, through cities where their own footsteps left no sound. It didn't matter where they went, the silence followed. It was growing. They could feel it now, pressing against them, something vast and endless, watching from every corner, from every shadow. The silence was alive, and it was still hungry. One of them tried to fight it. He stood in the middle of an empty street, staring up at the sky, and did something none of them had done in a long time. He spoke. His mouth moved, his throat convulsed, but no sound came. The silence swallowed his voice before it could form, drank it whole. And then he was gone. No trace, no body, just gone. The others didn't try again. They kept moving, kept running, but there was nowhere left to go. The earth had become a perfect vacuum of noise, an echoing void, and they had nothing left to take from it. The silence stretched endlessly in all directions, suffocating. They realized too late that they had made a mistake. They had taken too much. The silence was no longer just a void, it was something else entirely. It had become an entity of its own, a thing that existed beyond them, beyond the world. They had thought they were its masters, that they had created and controlled it. But it had only ever been waiting, and now it wanted them too. One by one they vanished. A blink, a step, a thought. Gone. No struggle, no warning, just erasure. Until only one remained. He ran through the hollow remnants of a dead world, past buildings that would never again hear laughter, across roads that would never again echo with the sound of footsteps. He could feel it closing in, an invisible presence pressing against the edges of his existence, tightening, drawing him in. He knew what was coming. He had seen it take the others. And he knew, deep in whatever passed for his soul, that there was no escape. The last of his kind stopped. For the first time, he listened. And in the silence, he finally heard it. Not absent. Not emptiness. A voice. Not one he recognized, not one that had ever belonged to this world. It spoke without sound, a whisper inside the silence itself. It had been waiting for them to finish. Now it had what it wanted. And as the last of the ones who had made Earth go silent faded into the nothingness they had created, the world remained quiet. Not empty. Just listening. The last of them moved through the silent world, his form blending with the dim twilight of a planet that no longer spoke. He had no name, no need for one. There had once been others like him, but they were gone now, consumed by the very thing they had created. He had seen them disappear one by one, fading as though they had never been. He had run, but it had done nothing. The silence followed, stretched, grew, pressing in from all sides. He did not know how long it had been since the last human vanished. Time had lost its meaning when the voices were stolen, when sound itself was erased from existence. There was no ticking of clocks, no breath of wind, no distant echoes to mark the passing of seconds. It was just him now, alone in the hush of a dead world, or not alone at all. He could feel it lurking, a presence just beyond the edges of perception. The silence was no longer just absence, it had taken shape, become something tangible, something aware. And it was watching. His kind had always existed on the fringes, creatures of secrecy, never meant to be fully seen or understood. They had fed off the unnoticed moments, the quiet spaces in between human lives. They had moved through crowds, faceless, unknown, never truly there. And yet, in their greed, they had taken too much. It had been intoxicating at first. The silence was power, a force beyond anything they had ever known. It had started as an experiment, a mere curiosity, stealing a whisper here, a breath there, bending the fabric of reality just slightly. But the hunger had grown, the silence had spread, creeping into every corner of existence, swallowing cities whole, until, at last, humanity was gone, devoured by the void they had crafted. He had believed, in those first moments, that they had won. The world was theirs now, perfect in its stillness, untouched by the chaos of sound. They had walked as gods through the empty cities, reveling in their triumph. But the silence was not just theirs to command. It had never belonged to them. Something else had taken notice. It had begun with the disappearances. No struggle, no warning, just a blink and one of them was missing. At first he had thought they were hiding, retreating into the shadows as they had always done. But then the numbers dwindled. faster and faster, until they were nothing more than fleeting echoes in a world without echoes. And then it had come for him. He had run, across dead fields where no insects stirred, through buildings filled with the remnants of a life long since erased. He had tried to escape, but there was no escaping something that had no shape, no voice, no face. The silence had become alive, stretching, growing, hunting. It was no longer a void, but something far worse. It had let him run. It had let him struggle, let him believe for a fleeting moment that he had some measure of control. But now, he knew better. He stopped in the middle of an abandoned road, his breath coming in silent gasps. There was no wind to move the leaves, no animals to scurry through the underbrush. The world had become a painting, frozen in place, motionless and unchanging. And then he felt it, the weight of the silence pressing in from all sides. It was no longer empty, it was full. It pulsed around him, thick, suffocating, as though the very air had turned to liquid. The edges of the world blurred, darkened, folded in on themselves. He tried to step forward, but the space around him stretched, shifting without sound. The road extended infinitely in all directions, the buildings twisting at impossible angles. The silence was folding the world in on itself, pulling reality apart. Panic surged through him, though it made no sound. He tried to scream, but his voice was long gone, devoured by the very thing he had helped create. He tried to move, but the world would not let him. The silence was no longer just an absence. It was something far greater, something ancient, something endless. He saw it then. Not with his eyes. Sight meant nothing in a world without sound, but he felt it, sensed it in the way a dying creature senses the approach of a predator. It had no form, no true shape, but it was everywhere. It pressed against him, into him, through him. It had been waiting, patient, knowing this moment would come. It had let them play their game, let them steal sound, let them erase the world. Because it had always belonged to the silence. And now there was only one thing left to take. He tried to resist, but there was nothing left to fight against. The silence was inside him now, pulling at the edges of his existence, unraveling him thread by thread. He was losing shape, dissolving, becoming part of the vast, endless quiet. There was no pain, no fear, only understanding. They had thought they had been the ones in control, the ones shaping the world to their will. But they had been wrong. The silence had never belonged to them. They had only been borrowing it, feeding something far older, far greater than themselves. And now it had taken back what was always meant to be its own. The last of them faded, slipping into the silence like a whisper that was never spoken. And then the world was truly empty. The buildings stood, untouched. The oceans moved, soundless. The sky stretched vast and endless, unbroken by the cries of birds. The earth had become a perfect, unbroken void. Not abandoned, just listening. He walked through the ruins of the world that had once been filled with voices, with laughter, with the restless noise of life. Now, it was nothing more than an echo of what had been, a vast and empty shell that stretched endlessly before him. The silence was absolute, pressing against him like a living thing, wrapping around him with invisible hands. He could feel it, more than ever now, pulsing in the spaces between reality, watching, waiting. He was the last, the only one left of his kind, though he did not know for how much longer. The others had vanished, taken by something they had never fully understood. They had believed they were in control, that the silence was their creation, their victory, but they had been wrong. The silence had been waiting, patient and hungry, watching them as they had consumed the world. It had let them take and take until there was nothing left, until every voice, every sound had been erased, and then it had turned on them. At first he had tried to escape. He had fled across the vast stretches of a world that had once been teeming with life, now reduced to nothing more than lifeless frozen moments. But there was nowhere left to run. The silence was everywhere, growing, stretching, consuming everything in its path. It had started with small things. The spaces around him shifting, bending in ways they shouldn't, streets that stretched longer than they should have, doors that led to nowhere. He would walk into a room, turn back, and find that the exit had disappeared. The silence was playing with him, testing the limits of what remained of his existence. And then he began to feel it inside him. The silence was not just around him anymore, it was within. It moved through his thoughts, through his body, pressing into him with an unseen weight. It was burrowing deep, unmaking him piece by piece, taking away more than just sound. It was taking him. He stopped in the middle of a vast, empty city street. The buildings around him stood tall and silent, untouched by time or decay. They should have been falling apart by now, but the silence preserved them, trapping them in a moment that would never end. The world had not died. It had been frozen. He looked up at the sky. It was colorless, a dull, lifeless gray that stretched forever. No sun, no stars, no shifting clouds, just an endless, unmoving void. He wondered if this was all that remained of existence. If the silence had stretched beyond Earth, beyond the boundaries of space. He could feel it pressing closer now, no longer hiding, no longer waiting. It had let him run long enough. He reached out, grasping for something, anything, but there was nothing to hold on to. His hands felt strange, distant, like they no longer belonged to him. His body was losing shape, his edges blurring, dissolving into the silence. He had seen it happen to the others, but he had never truly understood, until now. They had not simply vanished, they had been consumed, not destroyed, not erased, absorbed. The silence did not just take, it became, and now it was taking him. His thoughts stretched thin, unraveling into the vast, empty void. He could feel himself slipping, his sense of self dissolving like ink in water. His memories, his identity, everything that had ever made him who he was being pulled away one thread at a time. For a moment he resisted. He tried to hold on to something, some last fragment of himself. But there was nothing left to hold on to. The silence was infinite, and he was nothing more than a whisper within it. The world around him darkened. Or perhaps he was the one fading. He felt himself break apart, his existence folding into the endless hush. And then there was nothing. Not absence, not emptiness, just silence. It stretched across the earth, vast and unbroken, an eternal quiet that would never again be disturbed. There were no echoes, no remnants of what had once been, only stillness. But the silence was not lifeless. It was aware. It had been born from the hunger of those who had thought they could control it, shaped by their greed, by their endless need to take and consume. They had been the architects of their own end, and now they had become part of what they had created. The silence stretched, expanded, moved, not through space, not through time, but through something else entirely. It had devoured one world, but there were others. The universe was filled with noise, with voices, with chaos, and the silence was still hungry.